I was in Newberry. It was a Sunday afternoon after dinner, about 1 o'clock as I recall, and I had the Philco radio on, and I heard that Pearl Harbor had been bombed, December the 7th, 1941. And I joined the Army Reserves in along February or March of 1942 up at Presbyterian College. Went up there and enlisted, and then I didn't do anything else military-wise till I was called up in June of 1943, June the 15th. And I was, of course, already had my serial number and sworn in, and also I just went on down to Fort Jackson Reception Center and went in down there. I was actually volunteered. I had tried to get in the Navy Air Corps and the Army Air Corps, and had passed both exams, the mental exams and all the physical except for my eyes. And one eye was not 20/20, so they kept me out of both of those. And so at that point, I was under jurisdiction of the Navy for a while after I'd passed the exam for the V5 Aviation Cadet Program. And when I failed the physical on that, they sent me a notice that I'd be released from their jurisdiction and back into the Army. And then a week or so, they told me to report down Fort Jackson June the 15th, 1943. And I was in there for a while. I volunteered. I wanted then to go, I rode motorcycles at that time, and I wanted to be a scout and all in an armored or one of the military divisions that used motorcycles as scouts and so forth, the mechanized cavalry. And this boy from, name was Putman. He was from either Goldsboro or Greensboro, North Carolina. He and I were on orders together, and we found out where we were going, is out to California. Otherwise, normally, you didn't know where you were going until you got there. But being just the two of us, they told us because he wanted to do the same thing. But we'd been on orders for a good little bit, and all of a sudden one day they took us off the orders. They said they'd had too many casualties in North Africa with the ones riding the motors, so they had gone to scout car type. I think they were M36 vehicles, tired vehicles, with their reconnaissance and all. So then I went back and we went down to Texas with a 90mm anti-aircraft training unit. And it was quite lengthy, 26 months, longest I had ever heard of, half a year. And I went through that, and I was an acting corporal there when we were in training in charge of one platoon. We had 4 of us acting corporals in a battery. And we fired the 90mm guns, and I was in the range section, did the computing of the ranges and the lead time and all that on these Sperry computers. And when that was finished, it was in December of 43, we took exams for the ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program, and I, along with several of my buddies, namely those that had been corporals with me and some others also, passed the exam for the Army Specialized Training School. And the next thing we knew, we were on the train headed for Texas A&M. So we got there just a couple of days before Christmas. And of course, they had Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and all there in training already in various phases, different programs. And so we were barracked up on sort of the edge of the campus near Kyle Field, that big stadium, which is still there and still in use. And we enjoyed, and we were studying, in my case, I had finished my junior year at Newberry College, so I started the senior year there at Texas A&M. And we went to the program pretty good for a couple of months, and then they disbanded the program, did away with it, because they all of a sudden realized they were going to need a lot of men for D-Day on June the 6th. We were sort of on the edge of the campus at Texas A&M, over near the football field, Kyle Stadium, in some barracks there that were more like homes, but they had built them with barracks. The beds and all, sleeping quarters were upstairs, and the dining place and the stove, kitchens and all were downstairs. So we were told, so those boys that lived in the country, they could have the country hams and all sent to them, and they could eat right there. And we started our regular scholastic curriculum with I did that was my senior year there at Texas A&M, and would have been my senior year. And we went to the program by several months. Sometime, this of course, all the students, the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps, and Air Corps and all, came back off their furloughs, Christmas furloughs, and then everything started up in the classrooms, and I was taking the same subjects I would have taken at Newberry College, some of the same subjects, algebra, college algebra, and all that sort of thing. And we went into that, and then they decided all of a sudden, I guess they realized and through with the planning for D-Day on June the 6th, and they disbanded the program there and at NC State, Florida State, and a lot of the schools that they had the Army Specialized Training Program in force. And we went through down San Antonio, Texas, through a reprocessing and assignment center, and I went to the 87th Division along with a couple of my buddies there at Fort Jackson, Columbia, South Carolina, and went into it was a tank, not a tank destroyer company, but it was a anti-tank company, regimental anti-tank company, which was a separate company from the other battalions. And we trained there. And of course, D-Day came and went while we were there, but we shipped out an awful lot of men prior to D-Day and got in new men, and we in different training programs for them for the next group of men. And that went on through the summer, and we continued on until we got our orders that we were going to be shipping out in October to go to Europe. And we shipped out about October the 5th and went over on the Queen Elizabeth. I understood we had about 20,000 on there, besides the ones that manned the ship, besides the crew. And I imagine there were, because all three of our regiments were on there with attached units and all, plus one regiment from another division, because we had a boy in our company who had a brother in this other division, and one of their regiments was on there. So we went over and landed in Scotland. We couldn't land, the ship couldn't go down into Southampton anywhere on account of the V1 bombs and all that were coming in that area. So they tied up, anchored outside, and we had a bunch of little British flat tops around us when we woke up the next morning, got up on deck and looked out, guarding that big ship. And we came ashore on a fairly good-sized boat to the docks there in Scotland. Up the Firth of Clyde was where we were. And we went on down to the Midland section, the Pottery area of England, down to a little town of probably about 7,000 people called Stone, S-T-O-N-E. And that's where we stayed and trained some more, and did a lot of hiking. We had a lot of good hills to hike and things of that nature before we went over to, this was November, and this was the latter part of when we ate Thanksgiving done early, so we could get on the boats and go over to go across the channel, and we got on trucks, those 6x6s, and some train traffic, I think, at the time, to go up to the apple orchards of northern France. And we were up in those apple orchards for probably 4 or 5 days. A lot of mud. I'd never seen such mud in all my life, been pouring down rain. And it would just sink with you. Particularly in the roadways there. Truck would run down and you couldn't even see any ruts or anything. You'd fill in behind them like putty. Anyway, we were up there for a while, and we went from there by train on around down to the Metz, France area. There were 3 big forts that were still holding out down there. The 5th Infantry Division was down there, and we relieved them. And our mine platoon, we had 3 gun platoons in the anti-tank company, 57mm platoons, and I was the bazooka team leader in that. And they had men that had been killed up on the side of these 3 forts that they hadn't been able to retrieve, but our mine platoon had the mine detecting devices and everything. So that I know one of the things they did was go up there and retrieve a lot of those bodies. I saw them in 1 or 2 of the temporary morgues they set up. And our artillery fired on their forts, Fort Driant, Fort Jean of Arc, and there was a 3rd one, I don't recall the name of that one. But they just were on a timetable. They just had a certain time they had to hold up for, we heard, understood. And as soon as they did, they surrendered to us, as soon as that time was up. And we didn't get involved in, I didn't, my units, immediate units didn't get involved in any firefights at that time with them, or trying to take any positions from them. And from there, we went to Saarbrücken in Saar Valley, southern France. And we went rolling country. And we set up, it was a 10-man squad, and we set up our gun. We went into the area where we were designated to go. We were on the extreme right flank of the 3rd Army. Next guns to us were the 7th Army guns that were set up. And we were there to protect that flank and from tanks. And we got in there just before night. Fortunately, we didn't have to depend on our little shovels we had on our web belts to dig with. We had shovels on the truck, bigger shovels, and we had all gotten dug in, and our radio operator got on the big radio we had, which we could communicate with real good, but also the Germans could hear and pick up real good, to let them know that we were in position and everything was on go. And when we did, they stayed on that radio too long. They got a triangulation on us, and they threw in battery 5 of those 88s on us, and they hit all between us, and not a one of the 10 of us got hit. They punctured a tire on our gun, and they punctured a tire on the truck, and they blew a big hole in the bottom of a pewter big coffee container that we were going to use to make squad coffee. They opened that up for us. But we were so fortunate, and that was our baptism of fire right there. That was the first time we had sustained enemy fire directed at us. I thought my daggum heart was going to jump out of my chest. But after that happened a couple of times, to some degree you got accustomed to it. And but the first time scared the dickens out of you. Yeah. Not so much scared that you couldn't do anything, but you had the thing that you wanted to get away from it, and of course you couldn't get away from it, and there's nothing for us to shoot at. So you in a position that it was really making the adrenaline flow. We stayed down there in those positions, and they would shell us during the day, and they'd shell us some at night. They had some timed fire where they could make some of those 88s explode just like they were hitting trees or something over you. So we'd get shelled with those periodically, but not real bad. And one night, one day, we got word that something, that's the way they put it, something was going on up in Belgium, and they didn't know to what extent it was or anything. This was the early days of the Battle of the Bulge, probably about December the 20th. Started on the 16th of December, so it must have been maybe about the 19th or so. And we got word that we would be pulling out and going to Belgium. We'd be relieved by another division. And because Patton had already volunteered and said he could get us up there in a hurry, which nobody believed, but we did. So a couple of nights later, we were all packed up and ready to go. And at midnight, another division came in and took our place, our gun emplacements and everything. And we got on the road to going to Bastogne. Our destination was Morcy, Belgium, which was about 4 miles northwest of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne was pinned down. And we started up through winding roads and all going up there. There's a little sleet and snow and stuff like that. It started periodically, not in the intensity that it did a couple of days later, but every once in a while it was doing it. And it was cold as the mischief. And we went back through Reims and stopped for about 2 nights and a day there. Able to get our pup tents out and put them up, and we weren't able to have any fires though. So we still, it was very cold, but it was going to get a lot colder, we found out. And then we got the orders to move out to Morcy, Belgium, which we did. And as we were pulling into the Ardennes forest, I was always interested in what was going on. And I hopped out the back of the truck. I saw some fellas taping some charges, C4 charges on some of the trees. And I listened. I'd had enough, been close enough to artillery and all by that time till I knew incoming mail from outgoing and all that sort of thing. And that incoming mail, of course, is incoming artillery. And I listened, and I didn't hear anything. And I says, "How far is it up to the front?" And they said, "About 7 miles." I said, "Well, I didn't hear anything. I thought it must be some distance." I said, "Why are you all putting these charges up way back here?" They said, "Because this is where we expect the Germans to be this time tomorrow." So with that, we moved on into the woods and spent the night. And our 1st Battalion, and I knew some of the fellows in A Company, they attacked Morcy the next morning before daybreak, and we moved over on the right flank of Morcy to protect from flank maneuvers by the German tanks. But most of that tanks, they had about 3 tanks, they were already in Morcy, in the town. And they were bombed later on by our Thunderbolt P-47 combination fighter bombers in the midday. But I've never seen so much tracer in the air, tracers going as between our firing and the German return fire that morning down the road into Morcy before we turned off into this big field area where we had a good field of fire. And that lasted, it started snowing pretty good about midday some. And then later on that afternoon, we pulled out and went back to a village. And I don't remember the name of these villages, not too many of them anyway. But it was a few miles back. And that night, my assistant on the bazooka, he carried extra rockets and and loaded up the bazooka for me and tapped me on the shoulder when we were ready and wired it up when we were ready to fire. He was out there with me, and we had some chain links of anti-tank mines, and we pulled the pins on those mines and dug us a trench across the light snow that had fallen by then, and we were ready to pull that daisy chain across the road to stop the tanks. And we stayed with it all night because we heard reports. There was a field artillery communications trailer right on the edge of the road there across from where we were with our 57 gun and had our truck and stuff. And they said that there were reports of some that had already broken through the lines, and they were going to be, thought they'd be back in our area, but they never did show up that night. And by that time, the snow was coming down. And the next day it was snowing so hard, there was a narrow little road, and there was right across from the house that we stayed in, got in after daybreak. It was, there was a embankment, and then there was some various, there was a trailer type rig with the quad 50 caliber machine guns there, but nobody was manning them. There was no active. You couldn't see. You just couldn't make out like a silhouette across that road of what was on the far side for the snow that was coming down. So we had deep snow in short order. And from that point on, we went all around the different places and set up as the different units changed positions and all. We would go and set up in a field that had ample field of fire so that we could stop any movement of tanks and things. But that would have been kind of hard to do with those big Tiger tanks they had in there with that little 57 gun. But it was better than what they had had before they came on maneuvers in Tennessee to Fort Jackson. They had the little 37 millimeter, and that was real pea shooter, as we call it. And so the opportunity came up. They came around and asked for someone they were forming a Tiger patrol to go out at night, and they wanted volunteers from the different units, and they especially wanted bazooka gunners. So I stood around there, and the squad was gathered together there where we were next to a building there out in the area, edge of some woods, and nobody was volunteering because they didn't tell you much about what was going to happen. So I up some volunteers to go on out there to go with them. So it turned out to be a real good thing. I went back to regimental headquarters, and that's where we were based. The only problems were we wore the white German uniforms, the parkas, the pants, the hoods and everything. The parkas, the hoods were made onto the parkas. And I carried a carbine, a 30 caliber carbine up to that point, but I was issued the gun, there was a machine gun known as the grease gun because it looked like a grease gun, and magazine fed, and someone had taped 2 magazines with looked like friction tape in reverse, so you could pull. The magazines held approximately 20 rounds each, so you could eject one of them from the gun and reverse it and put the other one in because there was space left for it to go up into the receiving mechanism and for the bolt to work. And so I joined that, and we'd go out every night around 8:30, something like that, from regimental headquarters, and we had to lie down on the bottom of the 6x6 trucks that carried us up to the front. We would go out through one particular rifle company, and they were the only ones that knew we were there and who we were. And anybody else was told to shoot on sight, anybody in white uniforms. because the Germans were the only ones who had them. And so we'd put on those uniforms, get in trucks at the regimental headquarters and lie down and not stick our heads up until we reached the runner. They'd send a runner back from the company we were going through, whether it was A, C, or whatever. It would usually be 1st Battalion. And they would meet us and escort us and give the proper countersigns and everything to get us through to the front there. And we would go out from there and go out looking for these German tanks, because any kind of ammo or food convoys, anything they were trying to send up to any of the companies was getting shot at by direct fire. So they could, the people that knew how to detect that could tell from the explosions that they were getting shot at by tanks, and they had some tanks dug in. But fortunately, we never did find any. But we'd go out and we'd stay till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. We'd go quite a distance behind the German lines. And then we'd return to that same company and come back in and go to sleep, and we could go to sleep all day the next day. And the cooks were real good to us. They'd fix us up with hot chocolate and everything before we'd go out at night. And also when we came back in, they had coffee or hot chocolate or whatever we wanted. And they would bring us breakfast. We were upstairs there. They'd bring us breakfast and everything. It was a pretty elite unit, and we got treated that way. And we didn't have any casualties. So very fortunate. And so that went on until we reached a certain point with it that it was disbanded, and we went back to our different units, because we were made up from different units in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd Battalion of the 345th Regimental Combat Team, which was one of 3 regiments in the 87th Infantry Division. As soon as about January 16th, I guess, they considered the Battle of the Bulge over with. It really wasn't, but for the most part it was. And they said we'd go take a rest down in Luxembourg. So we got in convoys and went down to Luxembourg, and we went in a small village there, and we were in a house, 2-story house, and we were all wanting to get washed up some and brushing our teeth and all that sort of thing that we hadn't been able to do up in those snowed-in woods, where the snow was actually in the ditches was up to your waist. If you jumped out in a ditch, you'd go down to your waist and over the tailgate of the truck. We had that to happen. We had to pull them back in the truck. Anyway, we went down to this small town, village actually, and we were there. And I think it was either about the 2nd or 3rd day, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a Stuka dive bomber bombed us. And he didn't hit our house, and he didn't hit the house to our right if you were standing looking out to the street from it. They hit the next house, and it was demolished, caught on fire. And one of the men in my squad said, I was in fact at that time I was in the process of changing some uniforms, and we'd been given some uniforms to change to, and getting a bird bath as they call it and all, and shaving some and that sort of thing. And so I didn't run out of the house like some of them did, and he brought a little baby out of there, he said. And I don't remember whether any of the occupants were killed or not. But it was a fairly close call to be in the reserves. He probably picked up the panel. We used these panels on our truck that were changed around and laid across the hood of the truck to signify that that was an Allied installation and all. So he was pretty close to us. And we stayed there, like I say, for maybe 5 or 6 days or something. And then we went back up into Belgium in a real freezing cold convoy to Saint-Vith, and took over from a division there in Saint-Vith. And from there we occupied villages and things and took villages and things on down to the Siegfried Line. And we entered the Siegfried Line in that area, and where they had the Dragon's Teeth, the big concrete emplacements to stop the tanks and things. We went in there, and actually we began at that time to disband our anti-tank company, and some of the men were already being pulled out and sent to other units, especially some of our sergeants and things, to replace men lost in those, because the division was sustaining some heavy casualties by that time, and especially in that Siegfried Line. And we fought our way through the Siegfried Line and out of it to the open terrain again. And by that time we had completely disbanded our anti-tank, regimental anti-tank company. The other two regiments, I found out later, did not disband their anti-tank companies, but we did. And I was sent to, along with some of my fellows in our platoon, to a rifle company, Company L, 345th Infantry. And so we continued our attacking through the Siegfried Line at that time, and until at that point we were with L Company, and they were in a reserve. They had taken the little German town of Neuendorf, and then when they took it, they had such casualties, so they pulled them back into reserve, and that's where we were transferred to. And we were having a little problem with some of our bazooka rounds not going off when they hit the target, so they were sent back to the ordnance to have some of the disc removed that a gizmo had to punch through to set off the detonator in the rocket. And so they took out, I think, all but either one or two of those discs, cardboard discs, and they were highly dangerous from that point on, because it didn't take much of anything to set them off, of just a slight drop them just a matter of maybe 5 or 6 inches, and you'd have an explosion. And but we joined them there, and then we went back into Neuendorf and to relieve the company that had relieved them and let them go into reserve. And then the next little town was Ruth, R-E-U-T-H, which we could see very well from where we were. And I used an artillery observer's field glasses one day, and I could watch Germans running very quickly from one building to the other. And we were there for a good little bit before we attacked Ruth. But one morning, the night before, we worked our way up towards Ruth, and then spent the night there on the edge of a field. Got out of the woods on account of artillery fire. You learn real quickly to avoid the woods if you could. And so the next morning, I knew, of course, as the other boys, about 7 or 8 of us out of the anti-tank company, and they made a liaison out of me. They wanted me to go in with the lead elements of the company to Ruth and report back as to what the situation was. So I followed along behind the lead platoon, and as soon as they started attacking, I swung around to my right a little bit, fortunately, because there was a minefield to our left, and some of the men got in that minefield, and they were calling out to us, and it was pitch black dark, and we couldn't do anything to help them because our orders were to get into Ruth. We had to get in there and establish position and cover for the other units to come up. And that was what we were doing, and we were also picking up some machine gun fire from our own machine guns. They were firing a little bit too low. So as soon as I reached the edge of Ruth, I turned around and went back to our command post and reported in to them that they need to adjust the fire on the machine guns. They need to raise the elevation on them. And it was just getting daybreak then, and first light, and that we had some men wounded and calling out to us in the minefield, and they were beginning to sustain casualties going into the village of Ruth. And with that, I turned around and made sure I stayed to the right of that minefield and walked back. I could have been walking through some mines, but fortunately I did not set any off, and back into Ruth myself. And it was an all-day fight. We finally took Ruth about 4 o'clock that afternoon. And that night, I'd gotten in all the buildings were pretty much torn up with artillery, and I'd gone down in a cellar along with some other fellows to spend the night, and just sort of gotten comfortable, if you could get comfortable. I was ready to get some rest because we had been up, since very early that morning, and a lot had been going on. And somehow, and I found out many years later, a few years ago, I called to one of my friends up in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, and found out how they knew where I was. They came in and came down in the cellar and said, "You are Smith?" I said, "Yeah." Said, "Come with us, they want you at battalion." And I could never for years, all those years, figure out how they knew that. And I asked Will Gathers, who was in the mine platoon in our anti-tank company, and went to 3rd Battalion headquarters. And I met Will again many years later at reunions. I said, "Will, how in the world did they find me?" He said, "Charles, you didn't know it, but they kept tabs on you. They knew about you and the Tiger Patrol and other activities, and said they kept up with pretty much right where you were all the time you were with their company." So we went over battalion headquarters, and as we approached the door, there were some of the men that had been with me at Neuendorf and in there, but I'd separated from them. Like I said, I was by myself there, communicating between the two villages, and they were standing at the doorway to the battalion, and they had almost been stepped on by, and there were about 6 or 8 of those men. They had some of the L Company original men and some of the anti-tank men. They had almost been stepped on by a patrol. They had gotten down in a ditch and let the patrol go by them, a German patrol. And they told me, says, "They are everywhere out there." Says, "Don't go out there." So I went in, and this other boy from battalion and I were briefed with a lot of pictures, still photographs, but they were all from when there was a whole lot of snow on the ground, early in January probably, aerial photographs and things of road intersections. They said that there was a bridge down several miles out behind the German lines that they needed to determine whether or not that bridge was still intact. And and this other patrol didn't seem to work, so they were going to just send 2 men out to do it. This other boy and I, we were the 2. So they briefed us and all, and this first lieutenant doing most of the briefing, he says, "Why don't you take this Thompson submachine gun instead of that carbine you got?" I said, "Well, I'll tell you what, I've taken all my equipment off, and I'm ready to really move if we get ambushed. And I have fired the submachine gun for familiarization, but that's been a year ago down in basic training." I said, "I'd just as soon keep this carbine because I fired expert with it out on the range. I know exactly where it's shooting." So he says, "That's fine." So this other boy and I started out, and of course we had no camouflage, and I had taken off my field jackets and all my equipment, web belts and everything. All I had was my carbine and my ammo that was in the pouch that we slid down over the barrel and the 4-piece of the carbine down to the stock. And so he and I went down to that bridge. We were able to work through those road intersections and all down to the bridge, and it was still intact because they were going to break out a task force the next morning early, right after daybreak, with tanks and a couple of trucks and jeeps and things, and try to break out and disrupt the communications and so forth ahead of us on foot. And that was the whole idea. So we were able, but it seemed like every step you took, maybe we're going to be your last one, because you felt like you had eyes looking at you all the time, but we never did see anybody. Nothing happened. We walked all the way down there and all the way back. It took us several hours. And when we got back, we reported back in that the bridge was intact and all. So that was the whole deal there. I was wounded on April the 9th and with a tree burst. That was our last firefight we were in. We were positioned to fix the assault roadblock, a log roadblock that the Germans had put up there on their side, the east side of Tambach, a fair-sized little city there in Germany. We had been in a terrible firefight on the west side of Tambach before it was captured. We ran up on some German youth, and they had surrendered to us. A whole group of them had, and some older Germans were mixed in there, but later it was mostly German youth. And this German captain said that there were others that he knew had been rounded up and were ready to surrender in Tambach. And so we had pressed forward to get to Tambach, and we ran into more German youth, and they had approached. I went over I was a rifle squad leader by that time. Considerably before that, I'd been promoted after about 6 or 7 days with the L Company. I was promoted to squad leader, made a sergeant, and we were going to take this German position that they had up on top of a hill. And we got in a pretty big hurry to get up there because there was another squad we understood off on our flank that was pinned down. And I'll go back just a minute. This was on April the 9th. On April the 7th, also at that same time that these Germans surrendered earlier, for the first time I saw a woman in the ranks of the German soldiers, and she was a medic. She had a white armband on with a red cross on it, and she had on a very dark blue, like a very light winter gear. And she was blonde-haired, very tall, and they had surrendered to us. And just as apparently a matter of maybe 20 minutes or 30 minutes after I had moved out to the right flank in some woods to detect any tanks that may be coming through there before they got to that open country, they had some more Germans came up to surrender, and that was very good. They had the white flags and all, but they had some SS troopers sprinkled among them who had their machine guns on their hips. And on orders, as I was told, I did not see this, but as I was told later on, they approached our men, and on orders, these Hitler youth hit the ground, and these other SS men opened up on our soldiers there at close range with their machine guns, and they killed a bunch of us. We had 20 men wounded and 15 killed that afternoon there at Tambach. And before we got to Tambach, on the west side of Tambach. And I found out later on, I don't mean to jump too much about, but later on I found out from our, the one who's the head of our 87th Association at the time, our president or commander, that kept up with casualties and things of that nature, that our company, L Company, had the most casualties of any company in the entire division. And I told Howard Berry, who I spoke of a while ago, that one time, and he said, yeah, well, you all really had some tough objectives to take, and that's the reason why and we were a very aggressive company. I had shrapnel go in my back on the left side there, what they call the thoracic area, and it went in and turned and came back out. So I had 2 holes at the top and the bottom, and I didn't even know I was wounded. I knew some of my other men were, and I got them on litters and got them carried out of the, but I was up walking around, and I walked down to the tank that I'd ridden up to that point with part of my squad and all. I walked down to it and was leaning up against it, wondering what I was going to do with only 3 or 4 men left in the squad. And because I'd had 5 hit right there, and I'd lost a couple before in the firefight with the machine gun and rifle fire. And so I was down to 4 men, I think it was, counting me. And the medic came up to me and says, Sergeant, you better get your gear off. You're bleeding pretty bad in the back. And so I always carried, I had my men to carry 4 bandoliers of M1 ammo, and those bandoliers had about 8 little pockets in them. And a lot of people you see in these movies carrying them, they're hanging down in front of them. But I had mine on my back. Most of the men carried them on their back, 2 that way and 2 the other way, because that way you didn't have them hanging and flopping around on you. And come to find out, that probably saved my life, because when he told me that, he said, you get your gear off. And so I started taking I had to take my helmet off first, and it had just shredded that netting we had on the helmet, but it was I still had it on. And then I came down to those bandoliers, and I started off with them over my head. And not only were the individual clips of M1 ammo, it was 8 rounds to the clip, falling out of the little pockets, but some of the individual rounds had been penetrated. They were falling out of the little clips they were in. They were in an open type clip. They just smashed them down one after the other and fed them down from the top of the M1 Garand. And that's the way that occurred. I went up to battalion headquarters, and they gave me shots and put a tag on me, like a shipping tag of my shots and this, that, and the other on there. I don't know what all was on there. So they had interrupted. We were going to have some K rations before we attacked that that log emplacement they had put up. And that's when the mortars came in on top of us, the big German mortars. And so I went looking for our kitchen, and I found it, and the boys fixed me up some coffee and eggs and bacon and toast and all. And I had my coffee and everything. And then as I was walking back into battalion headquarters, I told them I'd be right back. Well, that was an hour or so later then, because I had not decided or made myself say, you are out of combat, get on back you're going to have to go to the hospital. I didn't realize how seriously I was wounded. And I just had difficulty, if you can believe it, from disattaching myself from combat, because I had been doing it so long. And just as I was walking, it was a little lean-to like covering shed over there where they'd parked the meat wagons, as we called them, the ambulances. And I was just started in there, and a bullet zinged off of one of the pillars that was holding part of that little shed type thing up. And there was a sniper in a building back to my left. So incorrectly, but I did, I just reached and told that they had a guard there, a new man, a replacement that came up. And first thing they did, they let him do some guard duty at the battalion aid. I said, give me your M1. And I reached over, and he didn't argue with me. I reached over and took his M1. I went looking for that sniper. Unfortunately, I didn't find him. And so it was about 5 o'clock that afternoon. I started hurting. I came back up to battalion aid, and of course they said, where have you been? And I told and it was no fun riding back in that ambulance to the field hospital, I'll tell you, because we had to go what seemed like 40 miles or so down bumpy little old dirt roads through those little old villages. And I could feel every little bump. And the fellow sitting next to me had been on the bulldozer. He was an engineer. And he tried to clear that roadblock that I was talking about. And they had opened up on him with a machine gun and hit him 4 times in his forearm right there. And he was in quite a bit of pain. Went back to the hospital there. And as we went into it, it was like a MASH unit. They had an operating table. I didn't see it at that time, but they had an round operating table, big light over it and all, with the surgeons around operating on people. But I went in, and they didn't ask me what my name was or how I was feeling or anything like that. You know what they wanted to know? Did I have any grenades on me? Because then, you know, everything going on, you forget about those things sometimes. Yeah, we've captured Germans that surrendered to us, and they'd still have those grenades stuck in their belt. But anyway, I went back and they x-rayed me and all. And of course, from that point on, they made me be on a litter wherever I went. They wouldn't let me do any walking. And so went into the operating room. I remember it. Well, prior to that, I was in a big room with a bunch of litters, and they had clotheslines strung across the room there, and x-rays up on there with clothespins. And they'd have your x-ray, they'd run those lines right across the string of letters there. And I took it down, you know, and checked it out, and I saw that big piece of shrapnel in my chest there, and put it back up. And I went into the hospital and into the operating room later on. It was about, I think it was close to 10 o'clock when we even got back to the hospital. And several hours, 3 or 4 hours on that, in that ambulance. And then it was a waiting time till they were ready to operate. And I remember they gave me that injection that put you to sleep, and they told me to count. And I remember getting to about 3, and that was it. I was out of it. And I didn't wake up till the next morning. I was up on the floor of a regular building that they converted into hospital-type units. And the nurses were all excited because somebody had strafed, one of the German planes had strafed them during the night, the hospital. And I said, well, we're in a building now, aren't we? They said, yeah. I said, don't worry about it. Of course, there was plenty of room to worry, but to me, that was like you were practically out of the war. I was sent from there to a strip where C-47s landed. They would call in C-47s just like you'd call in taxis. And it was a big open field with a bunch of woods down the other end of it. And I stayed in there, and that had big tents with all our litters along the edge. I saw my first prisoners that had come out of a concentration camp. I had never seen any prisoners out of a concentration camp. We had gotten freed up several slave labor camps, but those people were just some Dutch people in one that were very malnourished and all, but they were not in the condition that these people in the concentration camps were. But I went to the latrine one time there when we were in the tent along where the C-47s landed, and as a result, some of these fellows were in there from a concentration camp. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I could see how their legs and arms were just so very, very small and all, and everything was just, you could see the bones, all, just the skull, you could see all through in that area, the outline, skeleton type outline. They were in such bad condition, and that was my only contact with any of those. But we had one of our recon units was one of the first ones into one of those major concentration camps, but they couldn't stay because they were a task force just like we had. And you can't stay in one place long because they'll get enough German units together to ambush and take care of things. So you had to always be on the move. This was Reims, and I had a real good friend that we became friends there. He was from a different division, but we came to the hospital at the same time in Reims, and it was a very late model for then, a hospital probably built in the late 30s. Nice brick hospital, and we had a semi-private room and everything. And they put out the word they had a hospital train going to Paris. Everybody wanted to go to Paris. And I was out scooter pooping around the tennis courts and things like that because I was completely mobile. Had my left arm in a sling, but other than that, I wasn't in any problem. And so he said, when I got back to the hospital, he says, "We're going to Paris." I said, "We are?" He said, "Yeah, they came around." Said, "I knew you'd want to go to Paris, and I do." So I told them we wanted to go to Paris on the hospital train. I says, "Good." Well, we got on that train, and after we'd been going for a little while, I contacted a nurse there. I said, "Where are we headed?" "We headed to Paris." She says, "Nope, we headed to Nancy, France." So they just put that word out to get volunteers, I'm sure. So we wound up at a very old makeshift hospital down in Nancy, France, with some real good nursing and doctor care, though, and all. In fact, I knew I was going to have some more work done on my back. I had a few little slivers of shell fragments or something in there that needed to come out. And it was about time. It was about 3 weeks later to start. They didn't even sew you up to start with on the kind of infection. And he was sewing on me and got me remove those little fragments, whatever they were. And I told him how good he was, but the Novocaine kept wearing off. He was doing it under local, and he was probing pretty deep at times. But I told him he was certainly good, which he was. And we were there in Nancy, France, until the word came around to us that if you wanted to rejoin your original unit, you couldn't be hospitalized more than 60 days. And I think this was about the 58th day for me at that time, and him also, and he had been shot through the calf of his leg, and he'd been on crutches. And he signed both of us, told them that we wanted to rejoin our unit. I was gone again when they came around. He told them he said, "I knew you wanted to rejoin your unit, and I wanted to rejoin mine." I said, "That's fine, that's all right." So we got out of the hospital, and he was limping along on that bad leg, and we went on the train from Nancy to back to Metz, I believe it was. Got back to my outfit, and instead of us being troops that were going to occupy Germany, our General Patton, we were in his Third Army, he and our general had volunteered us for the Pacific. So we were the boys were in pup tents right on very close to the Czechoslovakian border. They had been in Czechoslovakia and had pulled back to just outside of the border there. And we were there for a couple of weeks and found out that and the boys, I was told, they'd sort of settled down by then, but they were some of them pretty upset that had been in a good bit of combat and all to be volunteered for the Pacific, because that was going to be a tough nut to crack. And anyway, we were there, and then we got on trucks and went through the same replacement depots that they sent new men up through while the war was going on. We went in reverse back through Camp Lucky Strike. They had different names for them in Oklahoma City and things of that type, back to Le Havre, France, and went back out on landing craft to the USS America ship. Her name had been changed to USS West Point that was America's largest passenger ship. And we had a great trip back across. It was just a 5-day trip, because she was fast, just like the Queen Elizabeth had been. And we had a good trip, and we were up on A deck, so we had plenty of fresh air. My unit was. Several of most of the 3rd Battalion was up there. We were supposed to be designated to go to Fort Benning, Georgia, because we had so many new replacements on account of all the casualties that I told you about earlier. And we got off there in New Jersey at Camp Kilmer, the same place we went through going over. And in fact, we were in practically the same barracks that we had occupied back in October of '44. This was July of '45. And we were to get 30-day recuperation furloughs on the way to Fort Benning. And so I went on a train to Fort Gordon, and they worked up papers for us and pay records and all, brought them all up to date and all, so we could get discharged. This was on a Saturday, so we get this given furlough leave of absence for 30 days the following Sunday morning, which we did. And I think mine started about July the 15th and ended approximately August the 15th. And my furlough went through the dropping of the big bombs over there on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and all, which was wonderful, because we then and later on found out that we were going to be one of the lead divisions on landing on the big island that Tokyo was on. And with 80% casualties, that would have been a real tough objective. It would have been rough. So we were all very happy with the atom bomb. I was on shipping orders to go up and put recruits at a Camp Indian something or another up in Pennsylvania. And I went to personnel. I knew a man there from Columbia, South Carolina, who I had met before, and to see him about getting my orders changed. And he said, well, Smith, I hope I can get your orders changed, but said, you know, you were one of the first ones picked to go up there to this post and for training. I said, well, do what you can. He says, where you want to go? You want to go to Fort Gordon? I says, no, not how about Fort Jackson? He says, no, don't have anything at Fort Jackson. He says, how about Fort Bragg? He said, but you'll have to go to finance school. You'll have to go to a finance center up there. I said, okay, Fort Bragg's better than Pennsylvania. So I went to Fort Bragg and went into finance and enjoyed it. It was the fall of the year of '45, but I was classified essential and couldn't get out. And but finally, orders came down, and I was discharged on December the 17th, 1945. But I was discharging boys with 30. I had about 75 or 80 points, and I was discharging with 30 points. Going to Fort Bragg was the best thing happened to me because I was in my 4th year at Newberry College, rising senior. I'd finished my junior year. And what I liked and what I did in payrolls and things at Fort Bragg, I found I liked accounting. And I had gotten disenchanted with chemistry, which I'd had 3 years of at Newberry College. And I decided I was going to see if I couldn't get into accounting. So when I was discharged and all, I came back down to Charleston to work because my mother had worked down there periodically during the war because there was a lot of jobs down there and she was a good bookkeeper. But they weren't around Newberry, and she'd come home on weekends and things like that. And so I had some catching up to do. My senior year at Newberry College, I took 26 hours one semester and 28 hours the next. I crammed all the accounting, marketing, economics, and all in that I could in that 1 year, my senior year. I came back to Charleston, and my wife and I were married on July the 5th, 1947.